Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Dunn. I'm obviously not Dr. James Sterrett, who was actually advertised to give this talk. Unfortunately, due to illness, he will not be able to be with us tonight. Uh, so, our title, Teaching Ferrets to Yodel, Teaching War Games to Non-Gamers. Let's start off with giving credit where credit is due. Let me go ahead and... We actually got this from Doctrine Man, who is the pseudonym for a strategist that still works for Department of Defense, Department of the Army. And those of you that have not seen Doctrine Man on Facebook, I highly, highly recommend you do it. It's very, very funny things out there. Some of the funniest insider humor you can absolutely find out there. So go ahead and take a look at the comic strip that this was based upon. And as you can imagine, teaching ferrets to yodel is a challenging task. Well, so is teaching war gamers to folks that are not gamers. But first, who are we? We are both longtime war gamers, and we are both have been teaching professional military education for quite some time now, which leads into our standard disclaimer. The views expressed in this presentation are the personal views of Dr. James Sterrett and Mr. Mike Dunn, and not necessarily those of the Department of Defense, United States Army, or any of its components. Okay, so some observations that we've made over the years. The first big one that was very surprising was very few of our students enjoy studying military history, which was a shock to us because both James and I are absolute avid fanatics of studying military history, so much so that Dr. Sterrett's doctorate is in military history. I, however, have kept my amateur status as a historian. Even fewer of our students enjoy playing tabletop board games. Yes, I know, completely unbelievable to this audience, but yes, there are people out there that don't like playing board games. Even fewer of that set have ever played a war game. And finally, even fewer of that set play historical war games for fun. Again, surprising to both James and I, because we had both been war gamers for 40 years plus each. So something that we really enjoy doing. All right, so we've also noticed that there are some biases against wargaming. And the first one I want to get into is the institutional biases. Nobody likes the word game. It basically connotes a something that children do versus a simulation, which is the end all and be all. Not a game, it's a simulation. Simulation is realistic, something that professionals deal with. Okay, here's the disclaimer there. A simulation, by definition, is a series of models iterated over time. By definition, when you add human decisions into a simulation, you have a game. And if that game happens to be on a military topic or a topic of competition and conflict, it is by definition, a war game. The other institutional bias that we see is, well, we're rolling dice. We're actually looking at combat results tables and looking up the rules. We all know that a serious game, a serious simulation uses a computer, which has extremely accurate models behind it, and nobody dares question the validity of the results of a computer war game because, you know, they are a simulation. Right, we'll come back to that. Another bias that we have in wargaming, well, goes back to history. The United States was one of the very few countries not to adopt Kriegspiel in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, and largely that was due to the mindset of the man at the top. Take a look at what William Tecumseh Sherman had to say to the graduate class of the United States Military Academy of 1867, and you get a pretty good idea that Uncle Billy here was not all about the war game. To be fair, what he was getting at here is that he really was encouraging the new lieutenants, the new graduates of USMA, to spend time out in the field, practicing their field craft, getting to know their men before they actually start getting into the higher level aspects that war games represent. Got it. That was his intent, but this was the mindset that was pretty much setting the stage for wargaming throughout the United States Army. The Navy, however, was a bit more open-minded. And of course, there's the cultural bias against wargaming. Pretty much wargamers, no matter what stripe of gamer that you are, well, most of society thinks we're a bunch of nerds and geeks and misfits and oddballs. They may be right, but doesn't mean that wargaming is not useful. So, how do we overcome these biases against wargaming? Well, one way is to teach the history of wargaming. I've already mentioned briefly about Prussians defeated the superpower at the time, France, in 1871. And you look at the Prussian track record of using wargaming. In 1864, they decisively defeat Denmark. Yeah, okay. Prussia vastly outclassed the Danes in every aspect militarily, so no big deal. 2 years later, well, they defeat the Austrians, which is by any measure a pure power of Prussia. So that got some attention. But then in 1871, when they beat the entirely the superpower of the European continent, France at the time, yeah, okay, everybody sat up and noticed what the world was going on. And bringing it forward into the 20th century, we have the famous quote by Nimitz about how everything that they had seen in the Pacific, none of it was a surprise, of course, with the exception of kamikazes. But none of it was a surprise because they had enacted these actions so many different times on the gaming tables back in Newport at the Naval War College. But when you're doing this, you got to be honest about it. Take, for instance, the case study of the Japanese when they were wargaming the Battle of Midway. And Admiral Agaki had overridden the results of losing 2 carriers in the game. And of course, as history has shown, they actually lost 4 carriers, considering the turning point of the Pacific War. And of course, Agaki is promoted to vice admiral. We've all heard this story. However, here is the untold punchline to this. The reason why Agaki overruled the result of 2 carriers being sunk by United States airstrikes was because the airstrikes were B-17s, not dive bombers, not torpedo bombers, but B-17s, which had a perfect track record when it came to engaging shipping. 0. They were perfect in missing each and every time they were used against shipping. So the question is, well, was he right to override the results? Depends. Depends what you're trying to get out of your game. So yes, on the point of it being unrealistic, yes. And the point of not considering a result of a war game is to consider what if. Well, yeah, obviously he was wrong. Also, when you're being honest about it, gets back to the models that you're using. Ugaki was right to override the B-17 model. However, all models are wrong, but some are useful. This is one of the guiding tenets from George E.P. Box, one of the great statisticians in the modeling and simulation world. The question, of course, is how wrong do they have to be to not be useful? And of course, we have a corollary to this, is that all models are wrong. However, we see a common failure within modeling and simulation of going to the extreme of throwing every piece of data into the model. The fallacy is that the more reality that you can throw in there by hyping up the fidelity and hyping up the resolution, how accurate are the models and how deep do the models go, well, then you must have a really accurate simulation that can really be useful. No. Or look at the piece that's in red. Over elaboration and over parameterization is often the mark of mediocrity. The thing about models is you got to figure out what story you're trying to tell. If you try to throw everything into your simulation, into your game, you're not going to tell a really good story. You're not going to really get to the point of what you're trying to highlight. And of course, if all else fails, there's the appeal to the higher power. Go all dead Prussian on them by throwing Clausewitz. Since I work at the Command General Staff College, we worship at the altar of the dead Prussians, and we throw this out there to those that dare say nay. Yeah, in the whole range of human activities, war most closely resembles a game of cards. Absolutely. This gets at the friction and the fog of war. And finally, the way that we prefer to overcome resistance is, well, have people play war games. So, more accurately, teach others how to play war games. And you see our 8-step program that we have. Have the game set up beforehand, explain what roles the players are stepping into, declare how the players win the game, describe what actions lead to victory, show what objects that are performing actions, play one or two turns that are scripted, explain game mechanics as you walk the players through the turn, let the players play subsequent turns, celebrate your victory, creating more war gamers. Huzzah, we're done. We have achieved our victory goal of creating more war gamers. End of presentation. No, wait, no, that can't be it. There's more to this. Yes, yes, there is. All right, let's go into a little bit deeper into the 8 different steps. The first step is have the game set up beforehand. The first thing we're trying to get at is create that visual appeal. You really want to get to the that play brain that's in us. You basically want to have people look at your game table or your computer screen and say, yeah, that looks like a lot of fun. I want to play that. I say play brain because there are 2 brains that are being brought to bear when you are playing a war game. The play brain is the suspension of disbelief, as it's known in the cinema world. It's that aspect that really gets you and that brings you into the event. The other part is the game brain. The game brain really is more concerned about the mechanics of the game, what it is that you're doing objectively. What are the rules of the game? How do the pieces interact? And it doesn't really matter what's happening visually or emotively. It's really what's happening mechanically. Usually, when you have two put together, you've got a really good environment, a really good setup that people want to get into. Another reason why you want to have this beforehand, well, you want to cheat. You, as the instructor, you want to go ahead and you want to literally stack the deck if you have a game that has cards in it. So you get the cards that you want to pop up. Also, you can set up your game state that will best get to your teaching script. Teaching script? Yes. If you're going to teach other people how to play a game, you better have a script that covers the basics. Also, you got to rehearse this script beforehand. You need to murder board it, as you kind of see Julius Caesar here being the recipient of that murder board. We have found that for every hour of facilitated gameplay, it takes us about 4 hours of preparation just to get there. And that is being generous. There are times when we can double or triple that amount of time that's needed to play it, and needed to basically make sure our script is near flawless. Okay. Let's go into step 2. Explain what roles the players are stepping into. What we have found that really facilitates gameplay, particularly for folks that have never seen that game or games at all, is we adhere to the Sith rule of 2. We assign 2 players to each game position. Why is that? Well, we found that when we have folks that are not gamers that are being thrown into the game for the first time, well, they freeze up. They don't know what in the world to make of it. Whereas if you've got somebody that you have to bounce ideas off of, you actually have to articulate your thoughts for another human being to absorb and understand and have a 2-way dialogue with. It really helps getting them off that dime of figuring out what to do next. This is a red teaming technique called share and pair, or pair and share, where they are bouncing ideas off each other. Trust me, it may seem cumbersome at first, but it really, really pays off by having folks that are paired up and bouncing ideas off each other. Also, it has the added benefit as you as the facilitator listening in into that conversation, that gives you an idea if they're getting the game or not. And if not, well, you can basically gently guide them to where they need to be. All right, more to it. Steps 3, 4, and 5. I basically lump this under the category of use terminology that players already understand. Our students are military. They tend to be senior captains, junior majors, making that transition from being detailed tactical leaders into organizational leaders. And what we teach them are the different concepts that they'll have to use in that. An example of this is that when we are teaching a game about strategy, we talk about the aspects of strategy, the ends, the ways, the means. The ends, what are we trying to achieve? The ways, well, how do you win? And the means, what are those things that you're doing, that you're manipulating to get through your ways, to get to your ends? We also, when I'm teaching strategy, again, as an example, we also talk about centers of gravity and critical vulnerabilities. One of my challenges is whenever I'm teaching a game to a military audience is to take the rules and kind of rephrase them in military terminology in tactical and doctrinal terms that they can actually relate to. Let's go ahead and go to an example of this, is where we actually teach root. Those of you that never played it, I highly recommend it. A lot of fun. Not the easiest game to learn, but we made it accessible to the School of Advanced Military Studies, who uses this as their kickoff exercise every academic year by explaining the ends, ways, and means. In root, well, how do I win? What's my ends? Well, 2 paths to winning. 30 victory points or dominate the key terrain. Okay, simple enough. How do I get to 30 victory points or dominate the key terrain? And then we talk about how the players can score victory points, as well as the unique ways each faction can score a victory point. And we also talk about how to achieve a dominance victory, the alternate way of winning root. And then we talk about all the means, all the different things they're working with. And we talk about all the different pieces that each of the different players are working. And what you'll notice is that not all pieces are the same. Those of you that played root understand what a completely asymmetric game this really is in terms of the means you have. And we also talk about the different cards, other means, and we talk about the actions, all the actions that are common to everybody, as well as the actions that are unique to the different factions. But we've fed it in this context of ends, ways, and means, and it really helps our students organize all the different things that are happening en route into a framework that they are familiar with, something they've been working with for at least 2 academic years, if not since the beginning of their military career. And of course, we talk about the critical vulnerabilities and the critical capabilities that are part of military strategy formulation. So we talk about what the factions have that is great and the different things that they have to overcome. A lot of fun. Again, if you've not played Root, highly recommend it. Okay. Another thing that we do is that we have our turn script. We basically explain the game mechanics only as we need. Our script are really tightly controlled, and we will tell the players what they're going to do on turn 1. And our scripts are done so that we have at least one iteration to the game mechanics being played by that player. We extend that to 2 turns for root, just because we want to get through all the common game mechanics on turn 1, and then we want each faction to execute its unique game mechanic on turn 2. And then we take the wheels off. We let the players, after they get the basically a familiarity with the game mechanics, let them struggle through it of how they're going to employ those mechanics to achieve their ways to get to their ends of victory. Again, what's really key when we explain these concepts, use concepts that they're already familiar with. Take, for instance, the example of zone of control. Well, those of us that are dyed-in-the-wool war gamers from way back when, we know Zocs. We know what a Zoc does. We understand that typically if you're going to make contact with an enemy chit and counter by moving the text next to it, more often than not, our zone of control that the enemy is exerting is either going to cause us to halt our movement or to slow down our movement, pay more movement points to go across it. Well, your military professional has never even heard of a zone of control, let alone a ZOC. So what we do is I basically explain it is that you are maneuvering at an unopposed rate of movement until you make contact. And that's when you go down to an opposed rate of movement. It doesn't mean that you're stopping. It just means that what's happening is beneath the visibility of what's being modeled by the game piece. In our case, is that the unit has made contact and it is doing local maneuvering for to achieve tactical and situational advantage below the event horizon, event awareness of what's happening at that echelon that's being modeled. Okay, so let's go ahead and go. And some rules that we have learned over the years. Don't try to explain all the rules up front. They're not going to remember it. They're not going to understand it a game or before. What we are doing is that we're trying to use the script to walk them through mechanics one at a time and explain those mechanics in terms of military terminology and doctrinal concepts and tactical concepts that they do understand. The big red never, ever, ever do this. Don't read your rule book up front. They have no context for it, and more than likely, you're going to put them to sleep. Okay. Another thing that we've learned not to do is don't play the game with them. The reason for that is that we need to maintain that impartiality by keeping distant from the actual gameplay itself. We want to make it implied in our players' minds is that we're not playing to beat them. We're basically there to facilitate the gameplay and to basically help them learn the game itself. We're sort of that advisors, or as I call it, I'm your sergeant major that's going to give you advice as needed. There are going to be times you have to play. Sometimes there's multiplayer games that require you to jump in because you don't have enough players to play. An example of this is a wonderful Ian Brody game, Quartermaster General, a 6-player game. Oftentimes, if I can't get 6 people to play, I will jump in and I will take the weakest player position in the game, in this case, Italy. If you're going to play, take the one player position that is not advantaged over anybody else. Make it the one that everybody else can beat up on fairly easily. If you're going to play as the facilitator, play open-handed. Show them all your concealed information, such as your cards, such as your hidden units. Flip them over so everybody can see it. You want to make sure that your players understand that you are not playing to beat them. You're playing just to show them how the game works. When you do play, walk through your thought process as when you are playing the game. Why are you making this decision about this mechanic? And finally, don't play to win. And of course, that's something you're trying to get at, that by all means, game on. All right, let me go on a tangent on the don't play to win. It's very, very rare that in our classes that we actually play to conclusion. One, we don't have the time for it. And two, well, it's deliberate. We always call index to the game experience while the game outcome is still in doubt. Reason being is if you play to conclusion, the player that won the game, he's going to disengage as she thinks she is awesome and all that is a real Clausewitz and Rommel and Patton all rolled into one. They don't need to listen to any of the post-game hot wash or AAR. They got this. On the other side of that, if the side that loses, well, they're going to think to themselves, this game stinks. I, of course, was perfect in my thought process. I don't make mistakes. It was the game that screwed me over, or the dice were terrible, and they will disengage from your hot wash and game mechanics. So that's, again, one of the little techniques that we have honed over the years to keep people engaged. Typically, the reaction that we're looking for, that when we call index, is that we want a collective groan to come up from our students going, no, 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 just one more. And that's when we know we got them. What I will do is I'll call index, and then I'll give them a 5, 6, 7 minute break do take care of what they have to, and then come back for the AAR. I know they're really engaged. If they don't go off to grab a drink of water or use the restroom, they'll actually talk about the game, and they'll basically do it on their own time, talking with each other about what they just experienced. That is also a great hallmark of a game that is being played very well and leads to all sorts of great learning beyond that. Okay, so the end result, victory. We had the von Muffling moment. This is Field Marshal Karl Verheer von Muffling, who was the chief of the Prussian General Staff, who was ordered by the Crown Prince of Prussia to listen to Lieutenant von Reiswitz. So yeah, imagine the chief of staff of your armed forces being told that they need to listen to a first lieutenant about this whole new thing. Yeah, that's kind of von Muffling's reaction. Was very, very skeptical at first. What is this guy going to tell me that I don't already know? Well, as Reiswitz walked him through Kriegspiel, he saw that, hey, this is useful to the point that he exclaimed, "It's not a game at all. It is training for war. I shall recommend it to the whole of the army." And this is how every regiment in the Prussian army was issued a set of Kriegspiel and mandated how to use it. But that's a talk for another time. Okay, so that in general is how we teach games to non-gamers. Well, let's talk about some other aspects of this, is that there is still going to be pushback. You are still going to have folks that aren't necessarily bought in completely on it, and they will still push back. The most common one is the "I am too cool for this." The nerds. And of course, they'll snicker and laugh and tee hee. It's like, oh, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? Ha 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 ha. Yes, yes, we are playing Dungeons and Dragons. I have actually forced my students, if I have a large percentage of my students that have this attitude, to actually play Dungeons and Dragons. I use the epic encounters that are absolutely fantastic, where you've got a very small scenario already laid out with the game map, with the dungeon on it, with the game miniatures already in it. And I actually have some pre-rolled characters. And I will force them to play through Dungeons and Dragons. And oftentimes what happens is that they see that this is not just a bunch of grown-up geeks playing make-believe. It actually is some crunchiness to it. There actually some real decisions to be made. I will deliberately have my party of tanks, basically fighters, paladins, barbarians, and healers, clerics, and magic users, basically long-range fire support, and archers, short-range fire support. And I will put them in a situation where they have to manage how all these different aspects are coming together. And I've had more than one student have the light bulb moment going off over their head, going like, oh, right, okay, this is combined arms. Now I understand why we're doing this. Also, it's kind of fun to see the look of horror that comes across their face. And I tell them to roll for initiative and give them a D20. And yes, I go full-blown nerd on them. I have a set of light-up polyhedral dice that I use for my D&D games. It's fun. Okay, the other pushback. Again, a lot of the folks institutionally, they want a computer game because computer games are far more accurate and realistic than, just rolling dice. Yeah, you don't know that. This is where we bring back George E.P. Box here. All models are wrong, some are useful. Practical question is, how wrong do they have to be to not be useful? If you're playing a computer game, you don't know that. You don't see the model. You're just taking it on faith that the models underlying the engine, in our case, the Whopper here, are accurate. Well, no, we don't. I've actually seen some of the algorithms for some computer games that have been used at DoD and the Army, and they're horrible. You're getting outcomes that are absolutely no way realistic. The models no way correspond to what happens in real life. But because you don't know this, you're taking it on faith. All hail the Deus ex machina. The computer has spoken, the computer must be obeyed. I like computer games in the right context. As long as you understand what is happening under the engine, or you're agreeing up front that whatever the computer spits out doesn't have to be accurate. This has to be useful to drive the discussion point. That's fine. If you understand the limitation, then yes, this model is still useful. And finally, and this is the one that really puts me off, sends me off in orbit, is these games are hard. Why can't we use something simpler? Yeah, so is the profession of arms. You have entered into this profession. We are giving you the lives of our sons and daughters. You have an obligation to keep current in your profession. I liken this to who would you trust your child for your medical care if they needed surgery? You want them to see the surgeon that stopped any learning and keeping up with the medical profession the day that they graduated and got their doctoral diploma and started practice? Or do you want the doctor that actually keeps up with the medical journals and goes to the symposiums and keeps up with what's going on in their profession? Yeah, that's how I want my military officers to look at the profession. If they cannot be bothered to take on the hard mental task of doing this, I'll find something else to do. It's kind of the mental equivalent of not keeping yourself in good physical shape, calling yourself a military professional. Kind of a hard note to end on, but at this point, what questions do you have?
Hey, Mike, we have a couple questions. One question says, games usually have a clear winner, but in reality, not so much. How often do you address the complexity in wargame winning? You mentioned how you don't really do winning, as you indexed a little earlier for various reasons, but if you were wanted to get people to understand the complexity of winning.
Funny you should say that. One of the things about most war games, particularly the commercial off-the-shelf ones, is that each of the scenarios has a very clear winning condition already stated. Yeah, unfortunately, real life isn't that easy. It's oftentimes, as you have more and more complex situations that you find yourself in, what constitutes winning is not cut and dry. One of the things I like to do is if I'm going to have a group of military professionals play a game, and I have lots of time to do this, is I ask them, it's like, okay, this is the tactical situation. Here's the guidance that you're being given from higher. Here are the missions you're being assigned. You tell me what constitutes winning. What is the victory conditions? And what that is an outcome from is that at our level, is that we have our students become proficient with the military decision-making process. The first step of that process is mission analysis. In mission analysis, you have to decide what constitutes your end state. The commander has to issue his guidance, his intent. What is she trying to achieve with this mission? Why are we doing these things? What does victory look like? I really like that as a technique, as it really forces some real mental analysis on the part of our players. So I asked them, do the game rules, does their victory conditions kind of correspond to what you would consider victory conditions? And a good example of that is a lot of off-the-shelf games as a victory condition is they need to occupy X number of hexes within Y number of turns to be victorious. Well, what happens if you as a player decide that what wins for you is not so much the occupation of territory, but the destruction of enemy pieces, the destruction of the enemy and their ability to put up any resistance to further operations? Well, that's fair. The analogy there is what happened in the American Civil War, where at the early part of the war, all the Union generals said, Richmond, we must take Richmond. And so they spent the first few years conducting the operations to do so. Well, Richmond was finally taken in 1865, and it did not end the war. What did end the war was the destruction of the Confederate Army. Grant saw this as the real aim that needs to be taken care of to bring the Civil War to a halt. So again, it's a good technique. Next question.
The next question asks, how many rules can you teach in one sitting? Perhaps a dozen or two. There has to be a practical limit with students. Does the number decrease with the age of the students?
No, actually it doesn't. That's part of the reason why we link rule mechanics to concepts they're already familiar with. Actually, if I have a student that actually has many years of experience at the tactical level, they can usually catch on to what the game mechanic is trying to represent. As far as how many, I kind of like the rule of span of control of no more than 5 to 7 things that you can keep in your mind all at one time. I find that if you do more than 7 discrete things, you really kind of lose your ability to keep it all together. As you play these games, if you get more practice at it, that span of control rises up to maybe 10 or a dozen. And those of you that have played these war games, you look through this sequence of play, and you understand that there's maybe 8 or 9 steps really per game turn, and each of those concepts are discrete enough that you, after you understand them, you have enough to play the game. There are exceptions, of course. You've got games like the wonderful Next War series game that Michelin has put together, which has got step after step after step of concepts. And I love that game because it really does a deep dive into all complexity of multi-domain operations. However, it's not a game I can teach someone that has never played a game before, just because there's just so many rules that are in there. So to answer the question, about 5 to 7 different game mechanics or concepts.
Next question says, a recent article came out outlined 2 AD USMC company leaders who ran an experiment on their infantry company using a Memoir 44 tournament. Do you have competitions or tournament models to encourage buy-in or investment from a group or non-gamer?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The military audience is very, very competitive. So much so that they're playing for bragging rights. In fact, I always tell my players in classes that trash talk is always encouraged, as long as it's kept humorous, not meant to be vile and bitter. And that's the other part that we have to remind our students is that it's only a game. What's happening here is not to be taken personally. And at the end of the day, shake hands and laugh about it over a beer. One of the games I really have to do that for is diplomacy, where it really is cutthroat. And whenever my instructors ask, can we run diplomacy for them, I always ask, 1, why do you hate your students? And 2, what does it want them to come away with? And we always preface diplomacy with like, hey, this is a game to highlight that there are no friends on the international stage, just common interests. And if those common interests do change as the situation does, don't take anything here personally. Most part, our players understand that. They really enjoy the competitive aspect of it, and they don't take it too seriously, though.
So next question says, what are the best ease into wargaming games for new professional wargamers?
Oh, right. Back in the 70s and 80s, there was actually a slew of freebie games that Simulation Publications Incorporated, SPI, and Games Designers Workshop have released that were designed just to get at that. How do we get people to play a war game? One of the ones that a colleague of ours, Mike Arenbone, over at the Military Operations Research Society, used to head up the wargaming community practice, likes Drive On Mets, a very, very simple game. It's got maybe a hex grid of about 5 by 8 hexes, and it's got maybe 4 or 5 counters per player, and only maybe a few mechanics. The one that we use, that we have found to be absolutely fantastic, is the old Frank Chadwick Battle for Moscow. And it is still available. You could, if you Google Battle for Moscow, they have been printed several times in C3I magazine. You can still find downloadable copies of it. It was a freebie. And it really gets to a lot of the wargame tropes that we're trying to get at. We use Battle for Moscow to teach the concept of movement points. We use it to teach the concept of a terrain effects chart for both movement and combat. We use it to introduce the concepts of zone of control, as well as a combat results table. And we also like using the sequence of play. What's really brilliant about Battle for Moscow is that the Soviets have a unique movement capability that the Germans don't have, and the Germans have a unique capability that the Soviets don't have. But overall, it is a really symmetrical game. Yeah, Battle for Moscow is the game that we love. Another one is Drive On Mets. I think that's the name of it. I can't remember. Yeah, Drive On Mets, I believe, is the one that was also a freebie. There were also a couple freebies that were in the Napoleonic era, which I'm not going to mention because, well, to be very honest, they were pretty dreadful.
So I'll ask this question as well. Do you have any do you have any other game recommendations that are like non-traditional, like you're in land power? I know CGSC is focused on that, but like anything on cyber or space or air power or maritime games?
Well, yeah, there's this new game that was released in the past year, something called Littoral Commander, I believe was the name of it, that we really like using for multi-domain operations at the tactical level. We also really like using what I consider to be gold standard of modern war games, the Operational Wargaming System, OWS, of which Assassin's Mace is a module that most of you have heard of. The reason I like OWS is I consider it to be the truly first modern war game. What I've seen a lot of war games that try to model contemporary conflicts is that they're essentially using a game design that is a World War II game set with better stats. The star of the show in World War II games are movement and maneuver. Everything else is to facilitate that. OWS really gets at the heart of the game, as is the Littoral Commander, that the star of the show is intelligence and fires, our kill chain. How do we find, fix, track, target, engage, assess? Your movement and maneuver parts are essentially there just to assist and protect the intel and fires guys.
So on that note, in a similar vein, if I'm a company leader designing a game based on a curriculum for unit PME, are there any standout tactical games that you should sequence over several months, gradually increasing decision-making complexity?
That's actually a great question. One of the things that we go back and forth with is, do we basically try to find a bespoke game for each block of instruction, or are we better off teaching just one rule set and building off of that? An example of that is the standard combat system of MMP games. They're not very difficult, but they are common. The game mechanics are very meat and potatoes turn sequence where you're moving, you're doing combat, and you exploitation after that. And each of the titles of the SCS system have different rules that get to the unique aspect of whatever battle or period they're playing. So we can build on that. One of the games we like to use is Drive on Paris, which is the World War I treatment, the SCS treatment of the opening days of World War I. Yeah, you can build on that. The other answer to that question is get a game that gets to your purpose. Whenever an instructor talks to us, saying, hey, I want to use a game in class to get to a point, the first thing we ask, what is it you want your students to learn? What is the point of all this? Once we have that, then we ask them, what decisions do you want your students to wrestle with to get to that learning outcome, to get to that point? And then before we even think about a game, answer those questions. And based upon the decisions, we look at a game that offers the interface, that offers the best interactions to drive those decision making. And basically, a game has to provide information about the situation so the player can make a decision. The player has to have a way to put that decision into action into the game, and the game has to have a way to give you feedback on how that decision went. So yeah, it's really, I know it's kind of a waffling answer, but if it's going to be long term, find a rule set that is consistent. Simpler is better.
Also, I would recommend like small micro games, right? Like Gallipoli,
Yeah.
the Landing, or W1815. These are like really small, compact games that can be played within 20 or 30 minutes. They serve as great intro games. They're actually a little less complex than Battle for Moscow, but I love Battle for Moscow as a game because it teaches a lot of the game literacy that Mike mentioned before in the presentation as well. Before we proceed on to other questions, while we have the topic of OWS on, OWS, the system itself is not an easy system to learn for a lot of beginner gamers as well. So one of the reasons I want to linger on this is to ask you, how do you guys teach or use OWS given its complexity as a rule system?
Well, see, that's the ironic thing here. James and I have been wargamers for decades, and we cut our teeth on playing games that address not just land warfare, but also air warfare and naval warfare. So when we saw the game, well, we have played so many of those type of games in those different domains, is that we didn't think it was all that hard, which is why we were gobsmacked when we tried to get other folks in our faculty, mostly guys, Army with a land experience, to play the game, is they were completely overwhelmed by it. And what hit us was that they didn't have any frame of reference. They did not understand the land of the air domain or the maritime domain. And they certainly have had no experience with the cyber or the space domain. So that's when we realized that we need to kind of cut it back and spoon feed the mechanics to them. And as we're spoon feeding the mechanics to them, then we also at the same time introduce the concept in multi-domain that is being introduced to it. It's funny you should say that, because we're actually designing an internal development session of the published last year at Field Manual 3.0 operations. And we're going to be using OWS as a way to highlight the tenets of operations, so the new concept that were introduced, particularly multi-domain operations. But the key is bite-sized chunks, cut it into very small pieces and relate it to concepts that they already do know. So the challenge for us was how to relate non-land domain, the other domains, to basically land warfighters.
Next question asks, do new players find it easier to get into board games, and of which kind, whether they're Hexagon Control, Euro games, Area Control game, Kriegspiel, what do you find is like the easiest transition?
Because our audience are military officers, I find that the best game to hit them with up front is Kriegspiel. Kriegspiel, for those of you that have never seen it, is essentially you are taking on the role of a commander in a 1820s battlefield, and you only see those pieces on your game map adjudicated by an umpire of where your little avatar command piece is, both friendly and enemy pieces. If you put yourself on top of a hill and you have great visibility all around you, to basically see your forces and enemy forces. If you decide to set up your own personal command post in the middle of the woods or the middle of the town, yeah, you're going to be seeing the trees 10 feet away from you or the walls 5 feet away from you, and not much more. And it really drives home the point is that you need to go out there and get the information that you need to make decisions. And for the 1820s, well, that basically means a commander needs to be personally at the point of decision, where they need to make a decision and what information do they need to get that information to make that decision. That will determine where they go. Other reason why I like using Kriegspiel. If you remember at the outset, I said all of our students, very few of them actually like to study military history. I like using Kriegspiel as a leveler. All our units are equally ignorant in Napoleonic warfare. Yeah, I know it's kind of a snarky comment, but it actually is. If I use something contemporary, it will oftentimes favor the infantry or the armor or the artillerymen over, say, the intelligence or the sustainment folks or the logisticians. Using Kriegspiel puts everybody on the same footing. And so it really gets into the idea of information. How do I get it? Where do I go to get it? And what do I do with it?
So one of the things I wanted to ask myself also is, what are some of the common mistakes when teaching games in this sort of PME setting that people should avoid, right?
Oh, God. Reading the rules, putting up a slide show that has all the game mechanics, and going through that slide deck for about half an hour, 45 minutes. You're going to read every deck, every slide on that deck painfully, slowly. Trust me, speaking loudly and slowly is not a great way to speak to somebody in a language that they don't know. Don't try to do that. Don't hit them all up front. Cut it down into small bite-sized pieces that they get to execute so they understand. We also find that if we will introduce a game mechanic only as needed. An example of that is if there's a retreat rule that the game has. Well, we don't address that until we adjudicate the combat, and one of the options is the defender gets to retreat. Well, that's when we actually break out the manual and say, okay, here's your options. Here's what the rules say. You can retreat back 2 hexes. You can't end stacked up on a hex that's already occupied by a friendly unit. You are going to lose more strength as you go through an enemy zone of control, yada, yada, yada. If we told them that up front, yeah, they would never remember it. Only introduce mechanics as needed.
What tactics or techniques have worked and have not worked for you all as practitioners when trying to advocate for adding or utilizing gaming in unit-based training? Oh man, this question is like close and dear to my heart. Uh, I swear it wasn't a plan. Especially with a superior or institution that has no experience with it or has been adverse to it. And this is my life. Yeah, Mike, what's the
Yeah.
answer?
Enthusiasm. Be engaged. Show them that you are really passionate about what you're doing here. We find that enthusiasm is infectious. You notice one of the slides I used up front was the James and Mike show, and that's actually not too far off the mark. I call it the James and Mike comedy hour, where we will basically hit each other with different humorous comments while we're teaching, and if something to keep them engaged. Be charismatic if you're capable of it. Most of us aren't. Use humor. Throw candy at them. And yes, I'm being snarky there, but this is a technique that we actually do. I teach a course that takes place after the normal class day. And so I've got a grumpy group of officers that are being told that, yes, well, your classmates get to go home, spend time with their family. You get to spend another 2 hours with me. What we have found is that we offer them stale holiday chocolate from the previous holiday. And they like it. We found that the hit of sugar and chocolate perks them up. But we also found that even those that don't take the chocolate, don't drink the Kool-Aid, perks them up too. Just the very fact that we're offering them something. But yes, be engaging. Show that you have a passion for it. Don't just drone on. Don't be monotone. Don't be mopey.
Also, I will add my 2 cents, and
Sure.
it is always really useful to show one successful case study, right? Whether it's like one great session, one great tournament, one great application in a curriculum, because it is like describing color to the colorblind, right? How you
Yes.
describe orange to someone who has never seen orange, right? And the best way to show them is to get them at the table at some kind of commanders only like wargaming session or a faculty
Yep.
development course, or to show how one class has integrated into their curriculum and say, hey, this could be you, this is how you can use it. How can you use this, something like this, in your classroom, in your training, in your unit, and that will start clicking, right? You get to add color a little bit to their vision, and that will help a lot as well.
Yeah, going back to Kriegspiel, the two most common comments that we get from our students that have never played a game before when we have them do a Kriegspiel session is, first comment is, now I understand what mission command is all about, why we're trying to instill a culture of making decisions. If you are not in direct contact with your commander, as long as you understand the commander's intent, you can make the right decision. The second comment is, why aren't we playing these games from day one here in the college? Yeah, why indeed? Why aren't we?
So another question asks, how many students have you and Dr. Sterrett taught over the years? How many
Oh
got
God.
how many got what you were trying to convey? If you don't have to answer, if you don't want to.
Oh, no. That's actually a good question. All right. Each class at the Army Command General Staff College resident course is about 1,000 to 1,200 students. Of that, I have directly taught 100 students every year of that. So over the years, James and I have probably taught well over 2,000 students directly in wargaming. And we have been overwhelmingly successful. Only very few of our students have ever thought this was just a complete waste of time. All of them have come back saying, yeah, this is really helpful and useful. We get feedback all the time from former students of ours, asking them on advice or game recommendations that they can use in their units or their staffs. It's basically just seeing is believing.
So someone mentioned how they got Matrix games into the Army War College by incorporating the Commandant there. So I want to ask sort of a related question of, how do you get leadership at CGSC and Army University and SAMS, all those, and you guys all do great work. How do you guys get them all involved, whether it's faculty or sort of the administration? How do you get a wider support for what you guys are doing across the board?
It really is a top down driven attitude. If you saw my example of Sherman, who really put a wet blanket over the piece of Kriegspiel in the 19th century. If we don't have a general officer that's bought into it, that doesn't understand how useful these things can be, that attitude is going to carry down. Fortunately, we have not had to fight that attitude recently. Ever since the Works memo of 2015, where one of the deputy secretaries of defense, along with one of the vice chiefs, and put out a memo saying, we need more wargaming. We are going to mandate that you put this in your PME. And General Mark Milley had reinforced that with his guidance as the chief, is you need to practice these things that you're teaching. You need to use war games and simulations. We found that over the years is that the attitude is really softened. James and I, we half jokingly call what we've done a Maoist insurgency, where we have been trying to build an army of wargamers from the underground for well over a decade. And we're starting to see payoff. We're seeing our students who came to us as captains and majors are now lieutenant colonels and colonels, in some cases general officers, and they see the utility. They've seen the light, and they are really making strides into making this.
So I'm gonna give a few more minutes just in case anyone wants to add any last minute questions. But I would say, what are some interesting developments that are happening at CGSC in terms of gaming? Anything you want to share up with us, Mike?
Fight Club. Yes, we have one. Yes, we talk about it. Shoot me an email. See in the lower left-hand corner of the slide, POC, Mike Dunn, michael.b.dunn.civ@gmail.com. Shoot me an email and I will get you on our mailing list, our emailing list of our events. We actually do Fight Club events in the Leavenworth area for any and all that are interested. We also are very much interested in what our Marine Corps brothers are doing at Trilak Center with their Fight Club, where they're actually doing online war games, open up the whole community. We hope, with Tim Barrick's kind indulgence, to dovetail on that and build our own capability to do Fight Club events remotely. Take part in the stuff that Goose does. They have their own fight day. Go play games. Get good at them.
All right, so we have one last question. It says, what place do non-historical /fictional games have in the professional wargaming society?
They definitely have a seat at the table. You heard me say that I will force my naysayers to play Dungeons and Dragons. Another game that's really fun that people relate to is Warhammer 40K. It's a very popular set of rules that once non-gamers play it, they understand that, oh yeah, we're actually talking about combined arms. We're actually trying to influence the tactical situation with deep fires and deep effects. Yeah, there is very much a use there. You saw the picture I used for setting up a game table was X-Wing. Yeah, people understand that. They relate to it culturally. Star Wars is one of our cultural icons. It's a real touchstone that people look at that and go, ooh, that looks neat. Don't be afraid to use the fantasy and science fiction aspects to draw people in. It gets that play brain really engaged.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you taking the time and covering for James, and hopefully James will get better very soon. And we love working with you guys at CGSC here at Georgetown and at Goose. So thank you all for commenting, engaging with our talks, and so forth. This webinar will be posted for our YouTube channel. And please give a round of applause via the chat to Mike Dunn for his wonderful presentation.